Well, good evening, everyone. You're, what a beautiful congregation we have here. And hello to everyone that's watching tonight. Tonight we'll conclude the study of the book of Ruth. It started, I think, it started a little over 10 years ago with this story. 10 years have passed, and last week we got through chapter 3, and we came to the place where Ruth basically had proposed to Boaz and let it be known to him that she wanted him to fill the role of the kinsman redeemer and take her for his wife. And he agrees to do that, but he lets her know there was one person that was closer than him as far as a close relative, and he assured her that if that person did not want to go through with this, that he would take her. He would perform the duty, let me put it that way. And he kind of fortified that in chapter 3, verse 13, when he said, "As the Lord lives," so he promised her. And the last verse in chapter 3, Naomi, I think he sent her home with a truckload of barley that next morning, and I'm sure when Naomi saw it that she thought, this guy swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. Look at all this barley he's got invested in this. So I don't think she was worried about it. In the last verse, she told Ruth, she said, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter today." So chapter 4 begins with, in the New King James, it says, "Then went Boaz up to the gate and sat down there." So it was just like Naomi said, he would not rest until this matter was settled. He was already on the move. The gate was basically, I think, for like people that have gone to Israel and the places where there's a gate left. I think you guys have gone, haven't you? They had seats carved in the wall just inside the gate, and I think that's where the city elders or the leaders of the city took care of city business, and for lack of a better term, and maybe had court. They also had strategies they would work out there, maybe for war, and that's actually when in Matthew 16:18 Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." He didn't mean that the gates were going to chase people down the street. He meant that the strategies of Satan, the strategies of hell, would not prevail against his kingdom. So he goes and sits down. We're getting in a habit here. Everybody's starting to sit still or sit down. But and all of a sudden, lo and behold, it says, "Behold," or consider this, "the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by." Oh, what a coincidence. He just walks right onto the scene. Kind of reminds me of the time when it said that Ruth just happened to come to the field of Boaz. So I think that's even more evidence that God's providence is at work. And actually, this guy that came walking up, the close relative, this is like history just walking up, because it would have been something that God had planned from before the beginning of the earth to happen. And here he comes. And so Boaz says, "Come aside, friend." The Hebrew has got it to where it means so and so. I think it's a hard one to translate for these guys, but Hebrew says so and so, and Boaz says, "Sit down here." So he came aside and sat down. King James, you got to love this one. It says, "Ho, such a one." That's what he called him. Anyway, so he appeared to know him. Appeared to know who he was. He was a relative. He appeared to know his name But I think as the Holy Spirit inspired the writer of this story, that he left the man anonymous, and he had no desire to embarrass him, um, or really even to set his name before us, because he was going to just kind of pass into obscurity later on in the story. And verse 2 says, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. So once again, everybody's sitting down. You guys are sitting down. This is good. And you know, it kind of mirrors what Christ did. Boaz is getting ready to redeem Ruth. And when Christ finished as his bride, and when Christ finished purchasing his bride, which is us, he sat down in heaven. And Hebrew 10:12 says, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. Verse 3 says, then he said to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you. And then it says, and he said, I will redeem it. He's talking about the closer relative is saying that. He's thinking it's just the land. So he says, I'll redeem it. And so I guess you might say he had the right of first refusal. But he's just talking about the land, you know, and I just want to read something real quick. It's Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, about this process. And this one's a little different. There's some different scenarios here that kind of vary from this, but Deuteronomy 25 says, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. But if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, this is a great part. This is a great thing about God's word. It says, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. So far we're just talking about the land here. But then Boaz says in verse 5, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead, being Mahlon, through his inheritance. And obviously that law, the purpose of the law of the kinsman redeemer that we see in Leviticus 25, and the law governing the Levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25, which I just read, was to preserve the name and protect the property of the families of Israel. And essentially, God owned the land and didn't want it exploited by rich people who would take advantage of the poor. Not that they always obeyed. But when it was obeyed, these laws made sure that a dead man's family name did not die with him, and that his property was not sold outside the tribe. Verse 6, and the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin, or King James says, mar my own inheritance. So he says to Boaz, you redeem my right of redemption for yourself. I cannot redeem it. So it looks like he was interested in the field, but he wasn't interested in the woman. He probably saw the value of that fertile field, where I think Boaz could care less about the field. And he just saw those beautiful brown eyes of Ruth. I think they had two different things in mind, but it was all good. So, and apparently old so-and-so was more interested in his own inheritance than obeying God, because this was a commandment of God that he was to do these certain things. And so he's worried about ruining his inheritance, but yet after he refuses to do that, we never hear about him again. We never know what his name is, nothing. And but Boaz wasn't worried about losing his inheritance. And like Boaz, Jesus wasn't worried about jeopardizing his own inheritance. Instead, he made us part of his inheritance. Like Boaz, Jesus did what he did because of his love for the bride, not for the field. Verse 7 says, now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm anything. One man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was confirmation in Israel. Therefore, the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandal, and as far as I'm concerned, he got off easy. He didn't get spit on. So that's one good thing for him. Verse 9, the only good thing probably. And verse 9, and Boaz said to the elders and all the people, when it says all the people, it seems like maybe by now a crowd has sort of gathered watching all this, and it says, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Verse 10, moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired or purchased as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. When he said, I have acquired, basically the word redeem means to purchase with a price. So that's basically what he is saying. Where Boaz was worried, or where the relative was worried about his own inheritance, we see a contrast with Boaz in that he, this man, close relative, wasn't willing to take the risk. He felt probably that with Naomi, she's old, she's beyond childbearing age, and so he could just figure, well, I'll just get the land and I won't have to worry about giving part of my inheritance to a firstborn son of hers, because she won't be able to have children. But Boaz, he was different. He took the risk of love and obedience, and his name was written down in Scripture and held in honor. 1 Samuel 2:30 says, for them that honor me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. And that's essentially what the other relative did. He despised God by not doing what his duty was, to follow through and do what he was supposed to be and be obedient. I'm sorry for my getting choked up. My mouth's really dry, but so I think at this point you can see the difference between them. Boaz was interested in the bride and not the field. The field was just a stage. The field was just a stage, like for Jesus. He wasn't interested in the field or in I think when Satan tempted him, that's why we see that he tempted him with looking down and saying, everything I have is yours, I don't think it was much of a temptation, thank you, Sue, because he wasn't interested in the field, but he was interested in his bride. You know, there's a parable that Jesus told, Matthew 13:44, and it says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid. And for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. He wasn't looking for the field. He was there because he wanted the treasure, like we are to Jesus. Verse 11 says, and all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. They're referring to Rachel and Leah. She bore Jacob 8 sons. Between the two of them, she bore 8 sons. I think there was a total of, obviously, of 12, but 4 were from the maidservants. But with that, they built the nation of Israel, the leading tribes. It's interesting to me that how they prayed that, and may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. They said prosper in Ephrathah. The word Ephrathah is significant because the Hebrew word means fruitful. And so they're praying that she would be fruitful. The people wanted Ruth to be fruitful and famous and bring honor to their little town. That was a town where, ironically, where Rachel was buried after giving birth to Benjamin. Let's see. Well, one thing I just wanted to note in that was that we see these wonderful changes that came into Ruth's life because she trusted Boaz and let him work on her behalf. And it's this whole book, the whole Bible really just mirrors the relationship with Christ, especially this book. And like us, we have so many changes that have come into our life because of letting God work in our behalf. And this one really spoke to me. She went from loneliness to love, from toil to rest, from poverty to wealth, from worry to assurance, and from despair to hope. She was no longer Ruth the Moabitess, for the past was gone, and she was making a new beginning. Now she was Ruth, the bride of Boaz, as we're the bride of Christ. Verse 13 says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. And that's another example of his providence. He was definitely he had kept her from conceiving when she was with Mahlon. That was 10 years, I think, they were together over there, somewhere close to that, but she never had children. And yet, when she marries Boaz, the Lord brings conception, brings him a son, and that son goes into they all go into the genealogy of Christ. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative or a redeemer. And may his name be famous in Israel. Verse 15, and may he, the baby, be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, or a sustainer. And Isaiah 46:4 says, even to your old age I am he, and even to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made and I will bear, even I will carry and I will deliver you. Um, so that was baby Jesus, or baby Obed, but we have baby Jesus the same way. And it goes on to say, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. And 7 sons was a place of, I guess, honor back then. Sons were thought highly of, and to have 7 of them was perfect, about the highest honor there was. Verse 16 says, then Naomi took the child. I wonder if Ruth had problem getting this baby back from Naomi. It seems like as we go on, it seems like that. But then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. And they're not talking about actually nursing him. They're talking about just, nurturing him, basically. But and then also the neighbor women gave him a name, and the custom was for the men to name the babies back then. So I'm not sure what Boaz was thinking or Ruth was thinking. I know Ruth is just haggard, worn out, tired, and wait a minute. You've named our baby, you've given him to Naomi. Anyway, they called his name Obed, which means one who serves. He is the father of Jesse and the father of David. So Obed became the grandfather of King David. Obed would become a blessing to, obviously, Boaz and Ruth, Naomi, Bethlehem. It said he made Bethlehem famous, Israel, and the whole world as a part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. I don't think these people had a clue, these people from the Bethlehemites, that God had such great plans for this little boy. And some of these things are kind of ironic to me. I don't know if they meant on purpose, but they talked about Rachel and Leah having the 8 sons, and you look at this, and it said Obed would have a son named Jesse, and Jesse would have 8 sons, just like Rachel and Leah, the youngest of which would be King David. Then it goes to verse 18, which just seems to be a genealogy of 10 generations. Said, now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Aminadab. Aminadab begot Nashon. Nashon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz. And Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David. And I'm not sure why the 10, but you can definitely see how God, he just mingled the blood of the Gentiles with the Jews. Just how he is. He meant his salvation was for everyone. And this whole genealogy is just all mixed together. Doesn't even mention Ruth and Rahab and Tamar. Why they put it in 10, I don't know, but back early in the study, when we were talking about Moab, and that they were accursed, in Deuteronomy 23:3, the Moabites were not to enter the congregation of the Lord, it said, for even to the 10th generation. And but in fact, this has only been 3 generations from Ruth to King David, which is just another example of God's grace and mercy to me. It just incredible from the beginning of the book all the way through. I just wanted to look at a few things before we close. That was the last verse, but the main purpose of this book was, or is, historical. It explains the ancestry. It builds a bridge from the time of Judges to the period when God gave Israel its first real king, King David. But like every book in the Bible, it's more than just a history book. There's so many practical things in there for us, practical lessons for us, things to learn. There's times when we get convicted. There's times when we get encouraged um, as we go through this walk. And plus, one of the things that's obvious through here is that this reveals God's providence um, in a way and how He guided Ruth and Naomi from the very beginning, even when they couldn't see it in that sorrowful time in Moab, the death of Elimelech and the two sons. And then there was Naomi when she went away empty. She came back bitter. Remember that time? And I think as part of this book, it was great in how God even cares for us when we do that. I know. I think I told you the story one time where I was so angry at God for something I did that I was yelling at Him, and a friend of mine called and said, "What are you doing today?" And I said, "I'm yelling at God," and I was in debt by quite a bit of money, and I just gotten saved, and I thought that's interesting that God didn't cause that debt. I caused the debt. But anyway, God still cares for us even when we're bitter towards Him. He's okay. He's big enough to handle that. And then we see the end of what happened in Naomi's life, how He turned that around. But God directed Ruth, a new believer, and used her faith. And this is a big part to me that's been speaking to me. He used her faith and her obedience to transform what started out as an overwhelming, sorrowful, and dark time to a time of great joy and blessing. And I don't know about you guys, but boy, that's just a parallel for my life, the things that happened in my life. And it looked like it was never going to come out of that hole. And yet He did some incredible things. And of course, there's the book of Ruth illustrates God's work of salvation in such a beautiful way. The story opened up for Ruth. She was an outsider, a stranger. She ended as a member of that covenant community in Israel when she became married to Boaz. And once again, there's another mirror for us as we're walking parallel with that. I was an outsider. I mean, I didn't even know who Jesus was when I got saved. I had no idea. I knew how to use His name in vain, but that was about it. And and the book also illustrates things about our relationship with Him in the way that it deepens over time. Chapter 1, like I was just saying, Ruth doesn't even know that Boaz exists. Dell didn't even know that Jesus existed. Chapter 2, she makes that commitment in verse 1 where she tells Naomi, "Your people will be my people and your God will be my God." So she, in essence, makes a commitment to the Lord, whether she fully understood all that at the time or not. But then in chapter 2, she's poor. Her and Naomi have come back thinking that they're going to have to do whatever they can do to etch out a living here, because they're both widows. They have nothing really, and so she goes into labor. She's gleaning in the field of Boaz, and at the same time she's receiving gifts from him. Remember he kept just laying all this barley on her. And I think in the beginning that Boaz to her was just a man of wealth and a generous man. He gave good gifts. Once again, that's kind of like my relationship. I don't know about yours, that you make that decision, then the work starts. And remember the times when you're first saved and God would do something that would just blow you away. You know, that, I mean, the way, how does he make that happen? Well, he would give those gifts to her. But he was um, certainly kind at all times. But the turning point was in chapter 3 to me when Ruth got to a point in that relationship where it became more than laboring for barley and getting fresh water to drink and accepting and being thankful for the wonderful gifts and the mercy that was being shown to her, to where um, she comes to a place of submission, and she's resting at Boaz's feet. And we talked about that last week with about being at the feet of Jesus. Um, and she begins to believe, I think, in his promises in a different way. Before they were just gifts, and he said he'd do this, and he did them. But I think she begins to now believe in his promises in a different way. And so the result ends up being recorded in chapter 4. Now she's no longer a poor gleaner. She has Boaz as her kinsman redeemer, as we have Christ as our kinsman redeemer. And instead of being worried about his inheritance, everything that Christ has, he shares with us. He's given to us. Just a couple more here. The events in the book of Ruth occurred during the period of Judges, a time not real difficult from the time we're going through today, when everything seems to be evil and falling apart, you might say. And I know that sometimes I find myself, I forget what I've read, I forget the trust I'm supposed to have, and sometimes I find myself being very pessimistic, very cynical, even fearful of things that are going on as I watch this stuff on TV, and sometimes I just get just plainly disheartened with it all, and I forget that even though Israel had no king and they did what was right in their own eyes, and we see the result of that we can have a king in our lives if we let him, and he'll rule and reign in our hearts even through these times. And the book of Ruth should always remind us that God is at work in our world, if nothing else, after what we've seen. This is right in the middle of the book of Judges. And that God is at work in the world, even, I want you guys to hear that, even in California, he's at work, believe it or not. I know that's a stretch, but he's even at work in California. I mean, he's got people, believers, stationed there for a reason, and some people that are committed and faithful to him. I'd say it was nice. I just said it's going on, but even in California, he's working, buying fields and seeking brides. So one thing that we have to remember is, like Job went through all the stuff he went through, but he said in 1925, I know my Redeemer lives in spite of all this stuff. And Paul said when he was teaching the men of Athens, or speaking to them in Acts 17:28, he said, for in him we live and move and have our being. So I think instead of being pessimistic, cynical, fearful, and disheartened, we can ask him, what field do you want us in? Where do you want us gleaning and working and harvesting? It said the harvest is ready. It's white, it's ready, but the labors are few. So we can ask him that and just be faithful and serve him like Ruth did. And I think when that happens, we forget about the pessimistic, the cynical, and all that stuff, and we become and experience his joy and his grace and his mercy. Things just seem to change supernaturally. I don't rarely do this, but When I got done with this morning, I was thinking about a song that Stephen Curtis Chapman wrote. I think it was on his first album years and years ago. Um, I kind of closed it up personally by listening to it. It's called My Redeemer is Faithful and True. And just the first part of it I wanted to read. I can't sing it, so you guys will have to pull that up on your phone later if you want to hear it in a good way. As I look back on the road I've traveled, I see so many times he carried me through. And there's one thing that I've learned in my life. My Redeemer is faithful and true. My Redeemer is faithful and true. Everything he has said he will do. Every morning his mercies are new. My Redeemer is faithful and true. So, thank you. I know it's really caused me to have to sit back and look at him, and who he is in my life. And these things aren't just happening. There's a reason why these things are happening in our life. It's because he loves us, and he's providentially working, even if we can't see it in our life. And he's a faithful Redeemer. Father, thank you so much for this sweet little book. I know I didn't do it justice, but there's so much in here, and like in everything in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, we should be looking for you because you're in there, and this is no exception here. We thank you for the times in our life, maybe before we knew you, when we were living in darkness and lonely, broken, that you orchestrated things to happen to bring us out of that place, that you brought us back to Bethlehem. And Lord, just help us to be faithful and true. Help us to understand what it is in your word that you want, and take it seriously, like compromise, that we need to, we can't just keep making excuses for stuff. Well, that's just this, or it's just a little thing, but you, if your word says this, then we're to do it. And please help us to do that, so that we can have an incredible relationship with you, like Ruth had with Boaz. We love you, Father, and thank you for laying down your life for us and redeeming our souls, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.